Hi. So I just want to say a few words about the passing of Sir Sean Connery, who died in his sleep yesterday, I believe, at the age of 90. This was breaking news today, and it was a big story. Obviously, the headlines was about the second big lockdown, rightly so. But when I read it, I was kind of taken aback. I knew Sir Sean Connery was an older man. No one lives forever, but it still was, whoa, Sean Connery's gone. James Bond is dead. Um, I mean, Sean Connery is so associated with the role, even though he'd done many other award-winning roles, that he made it his own in many ways. I'll just say from the outset, he wasn't my favorite Bond. I'd be lying if I said he was. But some of the Connery films I really like, from Russia with Love, Live and Let Die. Excuse me, not Live and Let Die. You Only Live Twice, which was actually the least rated of the Connery films, but I liked it. Um, and Doctor No I liked. But and everyone talked about Goldfinger. I suspect Goldfinger is a tiny bit overrated among Bond films. It's a great film, but I do think it maybe gets a little bit too much attention, overshadowing some of the other films. But anyway, Sean Connery was certainly someone who made his mark on British culture. And the irony in that, of course, is that later in his life he was a staunch Scottish nationalist, which is not, a position that I can pretend that I support. It's something that's quite interesting that a man who's so known for playing such an iconic British role would, in his life outside acting, support the breakup of the United Kingdom. I do see an irony in that, but of course he was an actor. He'd done other roles in The Untouchables, and of course as Indiana Jones's father in The Last Crusade. Junior, Junior, do you see what you've done? I think that's an interesting thing. It shows what a talented actor he was as well. I mean, to get such a contrasting character, from the real rugged masculinity of his James Bond versus the sort of passive professorial father figure in Indiana Jones. It's interesting to see that that's the same actor. Um, it's also interesting that this year we've seen the passing of Diana Rigg and Honor Blackman. So we're now realizing we're seeing that Bond is almost 60 years old, and the people associated with those older films are getting older. So it is a kind of passing of a generation in a sense. Sean Connery had a very colourful life. I mean, this was a guy who'd been in the Navy, he'd been a milkman, he'd been a model, he'd been a bodybuilder, he worked in a funeral home. Um, he became an iconic figure of British culture, and that's something very, very few people can do. If you take the 20th century, iconic British figures, you have Churchill, of course, Thatcher. Um, I'm talking here the 20th century. Um, maybe Lloyd George among politicians, and then you have cultural figures, Elizabeth Taylor, the Beatles, of course, Audrey Hepburn, Sean Connery, absolutely, and there's others, Charlie Chaplin. But this was a man who really made his mark, and it's hard not to admire that, whatever people think of him as a man. And there's a public face and there's a private face. Certainly, all the eulogies have been that he was a very pleasant man, but there were controversial sides. The notorious interview with Barbara Walters, in which he justified slapping a woman as a last resort. He later strongly refuted that. I believe in looking at a person's whole. I believe in deaf famous people should be recognized for everything, good and bad. Connery was not politically correct. He was very much a man who spoke up for what he believed in. Again, I believe that warrants respect. His Bond was very different from Sir Roger Moore. I remember Moore said, when I say I'm going to kill someone, no one believes it. When Sean says it, they do. Um, I remember one of my earliest impression of the whole Bond universe was at my late grandmother's house in rural Northern Ireland. They used to play Bond films on Easter Monday. I don't know why then particularly, but I remember the advertisements that would show clips of the Sean Connery Bond, particularly Thunderball, from Russia with Love, films like that. These are iconic films, you know, they really left a mark on British culture. So it's even though you know you recognize he's 90 years old, it's still whoa, Sean Connery's gone because he's such a profoundly recognizable figure. You know, named the world's sexiest man, admired by men for his masculinity, admired by women for his confident masculinity and good looks. Um, you know, he was quite something. Um, Not without its faults, of course, no one is. But yeah, it's quite a fault. So Sean Connery is gone. So rest in peace, James Bond. And by the way, it's interesting to note that Connery morphed the role into his so much to the point that Ian Fleming, I was going to say Sir Ian Fleming, I think it was just Ian Fleming, actually rewrote the books to suit Connery because he'd originally seen Bond as a suave Englishman, I guess much like Roger Moore, but then he morphed it into Connery's Scottish roots. So yeah, let me know your memories of to Sean Connery. Definitely a man who made his mark on our island history.